In this lesson, we'll look at why I believe the doctrine of original sin is a true secondary non-essential doctrine and why I think you should believe the same. However, keep in mind, you do not have to. I am in no way saying that you must. So what we'll do is look at what it is, then metaphorically burn straw man views of it, meaning clear up some misunderstandings of the doctrine, then look at objections to it, which will be answered through looking at Psalm 51:5, and then the other more explicit verse that supports the doctrine, which is Ephesians 2:3, and then look at some problems with rejecting the doctrine. So first of all, let's look at what it is. Got Questions says it can be defined as the moral corruption we possess as a consequence of Adam's sin, resulting in a sinful disposition manifesting itself in a habitually sinful behavior. Or in other words, it is a sinful nature that originated/produced from Adam's sin, which is passed on and inherited supernaturally through natural conception, aka ordinary generation, which that term you'll hear again. And it is the reason all mankind and humanity itself is sinful from the beginning of life, and the reason we need spiritual regeneration and still sin after that. And it also explains and gives light to the doctrine of total depravity. Now let's metaphorically burn some straw man views of the doctrine. First of all, it doesn't mean that Adam or anyone else's specific sin, guilt, and punishment is passed on, because doctrine only says that the sinfulness that Adam's sin created is transferred, not the actual sin of eating the fruit. So it doesn't contradict the Bible's clear teaching that you are only guilty of and punished for the sins you commit, like in Deuteronomy 24:16, and that every time Scripture speaks of being punished for your father's sins, it means punished for committing the same sins as your father, which makes sense for one to do, since sinful nature is passed on through the father. Also, it doesn't remove personal moral responsibility, because it doesn't remove free will. Now, I say choice a lot, so keep up with me. What it does is it restricts the choices to being sinful, because the chooser's nature dictates the choice's nature. Sinful chooser by nature, sinful choices by nature. But the specific choice itself is chosen by free will. So like your sinful nature doesn't make you choose to lie, you choose the lie. It happens to be sinful, the choice is sinful because of the sinful nature, but the choice is lying because you chose to lie. And then finally, paedobaptism, infant baptism, doesn't remove original sin, because again, it's not a sin itself, it is sinfulness itself. And if it really did remove that, then you wouldn't sin afterward. So the most common objections to this doctrine is that they say there's no supporting verse or so. They say that Psalm 51:5 isn't referring to it, and or that it wasn't an idea until St. Augustine invented it. But we'll look at how it does come straight from Scripture. Let's start with looking at Psalm 51:5, which says, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." Well, first of all, this can't be literal because there are no records of David being a product of rape or a bastard, and I can say bastard because I'm using it to refer to an illegitimate kid, just like if I said ass referring to a donkey in King James. It can't be literal. David was not actually conceived in iniquity as a product of rape or fornication. And then it likely isn't hyperbole because it well describes original sin being passed through ordinary generation and making man sinful from conception. In sin conceived, meaning sinful as/from conception, and then brought forth in iniquity, meaning still sinful even during and after birth. After space birth, not after birth, one word. Now let's get into the other more explicitly supporting verse, which is Ephesians 2:3. It says, "Among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were," listen very carefully, "by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind." What else could by nature children of wrath mean except having a nature to be someone who earns God's wrath? Because that's what a child of wrath is, someone who goes out and earns God's wrath and is then subject to it. And Paul says, so by nature. So you have a nature to be so. And then what else could like the rest of mankind mean except that this applies to all of humanity, including both the receivers of the epistle, which some may say is only referring to them, but it also refers to those who aren't the receivers of this epistle, which is literally everybody else. Let's look at some problems with rejecting the doctrine. First of all, it leaves no good answer to why all men are sinners from at least shortly after birth, if not sooner, which is true because you have to teach a child how to share, but you definitely don't have to teach him how to be selfish. And if a separate supernatural inner nature that spreads throughout humanity isn't why man sins, then you're really left with having to say that it's the very existence of free will that makes and allows sin to exist, which would mean that it's by happenstance that all men just happen to choose to be sinners for whatever reason and are, for whatever reason, totally depraved. You may say, well, the reason is because it's easier to be sinful and totally depraved. Well, why so? Maybe because original sin. And so you see, if that's the case, that just the very existence of unbridled free will is why all men choose to be sinners, then sin comes from unrepressed free will, and so spiritual regeneration actually represses our free will then. But in reality, Scripture says the reverse, where being born again makes our free will freer. We are free indeed. And that being sinful makes us a slave to sin. The doctrine of original sin also makes the virgin birth seem less important and almost unnecessary, because it's one of the reasons the virgin birth is an essential doctrine. Let's listen to Dr. Vodi Bakum speak of how original sin relates to essential doctrines, especially how it makes the virgin birth so necessary.
There are those who have no problem giving up on the virgin birth. They argue that you can remove the virgin birth, you can remove the resurrection, you can remove all of these things, and Christianity won't lose its essence. They could not be more wrong. If Jesus is born the same way you and I are born, then he is born having inherited Adam's guilt, and that's going to become important in a moment. But as the Son of God, the unique Son of God, he did not bear Adam's guilt. He was born of a virgin, we learn. When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman. And so now we have Jesus, who is the Son of God and the Son of Man. Now we have Jesus, who is fully divine as the Son of God and fully human as the Son of Man. Although being fully human, he was not born of ordinary generation. Therefore, unlike other full humans, he did not inherit Adam.
Finally, let's end on why this even matters, because though the doctrine of original sin is non-essential, as shown, it comes from verses, so it is scripturally based. And without it, certain questions go unanswered and certain teachings don't make sense. And it coincides and adds explanation to other biblical doctrines, including essential ones. So yeah, without it, you're robbed of a lot of things, and Scripture does support it, so why wouldn't you accept it?